Hello, everyone, and welcome to Channel 18 TV News. I'm Don Julian. In the news, fire alarm systems, tasers, maintenance guidelines, county road standards and procedures, a management provider for a hazardous mitigation grant program, and a Northeast Texas Rural Transportation Board appointment were among the items on the Hopkins County Commissioners Court approved during their regular meeting on Monday. Neil Barker was appointed to serve on the Northeast Texas Rural Rail Transportation Board of Directors. The court also approved a 5-year contract with Axion Enterprises for 10 tasers for jailers to be paid out of budgeted allocations, with $2,000 down this year. Also approved was a contract with Fire Troll for fire alarm systems for the county clerk's office, the courthouse, and annex buildings. The Commissioners Court also approved rural transportation maintenance guidelines for Hopkins County roads for this year and next year. The court adopted a resolution designating Grant Works as the management service provider for the Texas Hazard Mitigation Assistance Program application and project implementation.
We get the privilege to meet someone else new from Christus Mother Frances Hospital. That is Edward Vaughn. He is Clinical and Operations Pharmacy Manager of Christus Mother Frances Hospital, Sulphur Springs and in Winsboro. And his subject today, antibiotic stewardship.
And my name is Edward Vaughn. I'm the Clinical and Operations Manager at Christus Trinity Mother Frances, Sulphur Springs. And one of my biggest things that I do within the hospital is help advance some of our clinical initiatives within the pharmacy department, one of which being antimicrobial stewardship or antibiotic stewardship, which is one of the things that we're going to be discussing today.
Okay. Antibiotic stewardship. So this is going to tell us how we ought to take notice and be cautious.
That is
with
correct.
This miracle drug.
Yes, that is correct. So stewardship being one of our pillars of our overarching ministry of spreading the healing ministry of Jesus Christ, which is a little bit difficult to do at times whenever you have patients with things called multi-drug resistant organisms. So over the past 3 decades in our nation, as well as around the world, we've been struggling with an epidemic in regards to multi-drug resistant organisms. Some of these things that some people may have heard before in the community would be things like methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, also extended spectrum beta-lactamase producing E. coli and Klebsiella pneumoniae. These are both typically urinary or GI related bugs, but sometimes can be bloodstream infections. There's a new super fungal infection that was just reported within the last month or two called Candidus aureus, and then vancomycin resistant Enterococcus. There's a plethora of other multi-drug resistant organisms, but when we get to the state that there are few and far between medications that are actually coming through the pipeline, and when I say that, I mean the manufacturing and research and development pipeline that are specific to antibiotics, it's dismal. And when we have microbes or bugs essentially that are growing and becoming more and more prevalent in society, we have to be a good stewardship in regards to our finite resources of some of these antibiotics.
You use a lot of big words, and we want to explore this a little bit more, but in a simpler essence, the very meds that we might go to our doctor to be prescribed might ultimately be causing more long-term problems?
That is very correct. There was an article that was published in the British Medical Journal about 2 months ago or so that was actually looking at that exact thing. They were looking at medical diagnoses, or what you came to visit your physician for, compared to if they had any medications prescribed from them. Mainly being antibiotics. They reviewed a lot of patients. So they reviewed close to 15 million patient charts in regards to different insurance companies. And from these 15 million charts, they found that 23%, or roughly 1 in every 4 patients, were prescribed a medication that was never justified. If you think about it, what do you do when you feel under the weather and you go to your physician? A lot of patients, or a lot of people in general, will almost demand an antibiotic. They want an instant fix to what they perceive ails them, which there's a big thing in the medical community of wanting to satisfy and holistically treat a patient, whether it has to do with their anxiety or whatever their preconceived notion about their disease state is. So sometimes we do give antibiotics when the physician or provider knows that it's going to be of no use. There's a lot of different signs and symptoms that a patient or a person could be exhibiting or showing that would point you towards having a viral or a bacterial infection. Viral infections do not require antibiotics, where bacterial, of course, would require an antibacterial or an antibiotic. So some of these things would be having a runny nose, or having a upper respiratory chest cough, the common flu. These do not require antibiotics. Sore throat, and fluid in your middle ear. A lot of these can be caused by viral infections. And what we would do in most clinic visits is we would do a couple of rapid tests, one of which being the strep test, which they can swab the back of your throat. We've all had to gag at that experience at one time or the other. And they also check during flu season, they'll do the nasal swab to check to see if you have flu, if you're positive for one of the rapid antigens that are produced by the flu. The throat swab is actually checking to see if you have strep. A lot of times they'll come in and tell us that we're either positive for this, negative for that, but as most patients, most people, they don't know what that means, and we don't do a very good job about educating the people. Strep, that rapid strep test, strep is one of the most common causative organisms with a over 97% negative predictive value. So what I mean by that is that with that particular test, if you're negative, 96 to 97% of the time, you don't have that organism in your body at that point in time. So there's no need for an antibiotic in that case. But we don't do a good job about explaining that. Some of the other inappropriate treatments with antibiotics would be bronchitis or upper respiratory tract infections, so things in your nose or in your ears, and then just common coughs and sinus-related issues that may not be bacterial in nature.
It's good to hear you talk about this, because we've heard this coming for a long time. Mm-hmm. Bacteria or organisms that would become immune to the drugs that we use to try to kill them. So I really hadn't thought, though, that it might be happening or growing due to patient demand. So if your doctor says you'll be okay, you won't need a med, you'll be okay soon, that sometimes might not feel like what we want to hear.
Yes, ma'am. The common cold rides itself out in 5 to 7 days. If you think of how long do they normally prescribe you antibiotics, for most of these things that I just discussed, we're treating you for close to 5 days. Your normal treatment for a Z-Pak, which is common in this scenario, is 5 days. Some of your fluoroquinolone utilization, so Cipro or Levaquin, or ciprofloxacin and levofloxacin are its generic names now, you're treating them for 5 to 7 days. How many patients have taken an antibiotic for 3 to 4 days and realize that they're completely without symptoms anymore. How many times have we checked our parents' medicine cabinet and found stashes of these meds? I know I have. Just looking through my parents' things and finding things that expired back in the 80s and 90s from when they were stockpiling antibiotics to try to save cost. I mean, this is kind of really alluding to the fact that we overutilize. And a lot of times if you're have that symptom eradication within that short of a period of time, it's pushing you towards thinking that it may have not been bacterial in nature. To your point earlier, the major, one of the things that they said in that article that I was describing from the British Medical Journal was a major driver for inappropriate prescribing by clinicians was their desire to satisfy their patients' expectations. If you come in and you're expecting something and you don't get it, which way do you lean on becoming a return patient? If every time you come to them because you get common colds more often than a normal person and they tell you you're not sick, go home, you're probably after the second or third time going to say, well, I'm not going to go to Dr. Joe Bob anymore. I'm going to go to Dr. So-and-so down the road. Maybe he'll finally treat me and cure me. And that's where we start coming into that patient satisfier being the major drive in a lot of things that we do within the medical community anymore.
And add to that instant gratification that we expect in today's world.
Yes, we all know McDonald's and drive-through pharmacies. We get what we want when we want it. So if you go to a provider and you're not getting that instant gratification, you're more apt to search for someone else, which means that they no longer have their customer base. They can't pay their bills, so they do what the patients expect for them to do for that instant gratification.
Well, I would say that our local Christus Mother Frances Hospital and the one in Winsboro as well don't stand alone in trying to inform the public, because you mentioned World Health Organization, CDC, also sending down information from their findings.
Yes, ma'am. So back in 2014, the CDC, or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, actually released a new campaign that was called the Get Smart campaign. And essentially the basis of it was antibiotics aren't always the right answer. Kind of pointing back to when do you need an antibiotic versus when do you need something else, something to just treat your symptoms, or maybe a steroid to help you through some of that acute or first stage inflammation that you could have. And I'll give you the infographic in regards to that, but it just kind of went over those things that I discussed earlier in regards to common colds or common viruses versus when do you need to treat with an antibiotic. Some of those things, again, would be the flu, a sore throat, a middle ear infection, runny noses, which we almost all get, and then your chest colds. Also things like the chicken pox or influenza. These are viral infections, and they cannot be treated or cured with an antibiotic. If you look at contagious things, viruses are much more contagious than bacteria. So if you're spreading from one person to your family to another person in your family because we all know that our kids and our little babies are vectors for everything. If one person gets sick, the entire family gets sick. Those are most likely viral in origin. Bacterials are only sometimes contagious. Viruses, you normally have a systemic response, meaning head to toe everywhere, and bacterial are normally just localized to where they're actually causing the infection.
These are things that we need to not only listen to right now, but kind of take to heart really, because this is something that we will be hearing more about. I'm glad that our hospital has such a thing as antibiotic stewardship, and that you're trying to inform the public, and your doctors are also heeding this as far as their prescribing. If there's just one sentence that people could take away with them, what would that be from today's information?
I would say one sentence would be that knowledge is power. So informed consent is a big thing, and it's a medical right. So knowing what you're actually putting in your body, if it's supposed to be treating you or not supposed to be treating you, ask your local pharmacy. Your pharmacist can help inform you on the risk and benefit of certain medications. One of our strongest workhorses out there being fluoroquinolones, or Cipro and Levaquin. They have a plethora of adverse drug reactions that can happen secondary to this drug, but almost everyone's been prescribed it. It's a big component of what your pharmacist should be educating you on, or just researching on the disease state yourself. We almost all have the internet. Inform yourself.
It's not like we have to buy the latest book and read up on that. We have magic at our fingertips. Thank you very much for coming in today, Edward Vaughn from Christus Mother Frances Hospital.
Thank you.
In sports, the Wildcats football team is just a little bit past the midway point of spring football workouts. After Monday's session, head football coach Greg Owens said he was not happy with the Monday workouts. He said teaching was going on, but he said players were dragging with not much fire or energy. Still, Coach Owens said generally good stuff was happening. He said players were learning and getting valuable reps. He said the players had been divided into two groups based on their age and experience level to avoid practice mismatches. Coach Owens said he could see progress. He's also beginning to mix in some special team stuff. Coach Owens said Monday they worked on extra point kicking, field goals, punting, and kickoffs. Large parts of practice are videotaped, and he said video sessions afterward with the players are very productive. The Wildcats spring game at Prim Stadium is coming up May 17th. Wildcats varsity and JV 7-on-7 football teams played in a Paul Pewitt tournament last Saturday. Wildcats offensive coordinator Matt Young said the Tanner Memorial Tournament was a fundraiser in memory of a young man killed 5 years ago in a traffic accident. He said the Wildcats were blessed to be a part of the event at Paul Pewitt. The varsity won one game and lost one in early play, and then lost a bracket game. The Wildcats started with an overtime loss to Dangerfield. Coach Young said Dangerfield scored late in the game to tie the score at 14-14. Teams then get a single play from the 10-yard line in overtime. Dangerfield scored, and the Wildcats did not. Coach Young said quarterbacks Caden Wallace and Noe Ponce both led TD drives. Coach Young said the Wildcats varsity then played the host, Paul Pewitt. Said Wildcats started slowly in that one and had some dropped passes. Coach Young said Wallace's passes, though, did have a better touch on them. He said receiver Campbell Cody made a one-handed catch along the sideline and then got into the end zone for a score. And Coach Young said the play seemed to light a fire under the Wildcats, and he said that they might have scored after that on every drive on the day until overtime of the next game. Wildcats defeated Paul Pewitt in that second game 28-7. Then in bracket play, the Wildcats faced Paul Pewitt again. Coach Young said offensive receiver standouts in that third game included Colin Wade, Landry Meskimen, Bryson Lacey, Dietrich Clayton, Zach Tiemeyer, and Chase Haney. He said George Greenway and Ryan Carrillo were defensive standouts. The teams ended up tied 42-42. Paul Pewitt then scored in a fourth overtime, and the Wildcats did not match that score. Coach Young said the Wildcats JV perhaps was a little overmatched against varsity teams from Paul Pewitt, Alba Golden, and Mount Vernon. He said despite being on the wrong side of scores, however, the JV did get better as the day went along. He said 20 to 25 guys were on that JV team, another 20 on the varsity. Coach Young said quarterbacks Ty Stroud and Matthew Sherman got in a lot of throws for the JV. He said the Wildcats are not in 7-on-7 mode right now with spring football going on. Still, Coach Young said everyone got valuable reps on Saturday, and he added he was excited to see the players improving. And finally, an athletic banquet for football, powerlifting, and athletic trainers took place Monday night at Sulphur Springs Country Club. Football MVPs were their 32 seniors. Powerlifting MVPs for the Wildcats, senior Carson Bridges, and for the Lady Cats, Sable Erdmeyer. Athletic trainer MVPs were seniors Jacqueline Boca Negra and Brianna Hernandez. Wildcats head athletic trainer Tammy Carroll introduced all of her athletic trainers, and Wildcats and Lady Cats powerlifting coach Casey Jeter introduced his boys and girls powerlifters. Girls powerlifting is new to Sulphur Springs High School this year. Wildcats head football coach Greg Owens, his offensive coordinator Matt Young, defensive coordinator Alex Guerra, and all of the Wildcats' offensive and defensive assistant coaches talked at length and introduced players in their position groups. Wildcats videotapers were also recognized. There is no longer just one big athletic banquet. Individual teams are now having their own banquets this year. That's Channel 8 TV. That's Channel 18 TV News. I'm Don Julian. Thank you for watching, and so long, everybody.